what to expect today. We are going to have a presentation from Leah Rothstein. Jacqueline's going to introduce her. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A that I will moderate. You'll see the index cards on your desk. Those are for you to write questions if they happen to arise while you're listening to the presentation. You will be able to raise your hand and ask your question yourself as well. And then for people who are online, there you are. You can just put your questions into the chat. We won't be able to unmute you and let you speak just because that is a logistical nightmare in this room. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll have Francis read them out loud to us. And again, I want to thank everyone for being here. This event is sponsored by the Region 9 Equity Team, and we're really excited for today. And I'll be back up in a little bit. And Jacqueline, now to introduce our speaker.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Banks, and I'm part of the Equity Team and Region 9 FHEO. So Leah Rothstein is the co-author of Just Action, How to Challenge Segregation Enacted Under the Color of Law, which describes how local community groups can redress the wrongs of segregation. She also writes a regular column to which you can subscribe for free at justaction.substack.com. Okay, one more time, because you can subscribe for free at justaction.substack.com. Leah has worked on public policy and community change from the grassroots to the halls of government. She led research on reforming community corrections, policy, and practice to be focused on rehabilitation and not punishment. She has been a consultant to nonprofit housing developers, cities and counties, redevelopment agencies, and private firms on community development and affordable housing policy practice and finance. Her policy work is informed by her years as a community organizer and also a labor organizer. And she has worked on issues such as housing, environmental justice, workplace safety, and youth leadership. So on behalf of the Region 9 Equity Team, I would like to formally welcome Leah Rothstein.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Let me know if my voice starts lowering. So thanks for having me. Thanks for being here. I obviously am going to be talking about racial segregation, how our country came to be a racially segregated society, and what we can do about it to remedy that and challenge it going forward. Before I do that, I'm just curious how many of you have read or are familiar with the book, The Color of Law, with the sequel to. Okay, most. So that came out a while ago, so I'll do a little recap just because it's important to sort of set the context of how we got here before we talk about how we get out of where we are. So as you all probably remember from reading The Color of Law, that book took on the concept of de facto segregation. This is an explanation we have adopted as a country to explain why we are racially segregated all over the country. All metropolitan areas in all regions of the country are racially segregated, particularly the segregation of whites and African Americans has been persistent and consistent for decades. And we tell ourselves it's a form of de facto segregation. It's not caused by laws or policies. It's caused by personal preferences. People choose to live in neighborhoods where people look like them. And so they self-sort into racially homogenous communities. Or it's a function of private actors, bigoted landlords or realtors who refuse to sell or rent homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. And that's why we're racially segregated. Now, when we accept or understand that that's the reason for racial segregation, we think, oh, it happened by accident, so it can only unhappen by accident. We don't have any responsibility to do anything about it, nor do we have any agency. There's nothing we can do if something just sort of happens beyond our control. Well, this idea is very pervasive, as I'm sure you're all familiar with. The Roberts Supreme Court has written in opinions that because the federal government had no role to play in creating segregated communities, it has no role to play in desegregating, so challenging that segregation. So, this idea very pervasive in our country. In 2017, my dad wrote The Color of Law to challenge that idea. It is filled with detailed examples of government policies and actions that created, required the creation of segregated communities and then required that that segregation be maintained and sustained. And what he argued is that, you know, private actors aren't off the hook either. The private actors like landlords, realtors, developers, banks, insurance companies, they had a role to play in creating segregation. But their actions were incentivized and often explicitly required by the government at all levels to ensure that as they created communities, built out communities, that they created them on a segregated basis. That these actions of the government to do this is that they were a violation of the Constitution, the 5th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. And as such, when we sort of as a country reckon with that fact, when our government has violated the Constitution, we have an obligation and responsibility to remedy that violation. That was sort of the big call to action in the color of law. We, you know, if we reckon with this history, we know we have to do something about it. We can't just let sort of accidents undo and, fix itself. But, you know, it doesn't necessarily mean we know what to do about it. So, you know, my dad, he wanted to retire after reading the color of law. It's fair, but he thought that call to action was enough. Once we realize we have an obligation, people will start doing something to live up to that obligation. But he got enough people asking him after he spoke about the color of law and after they read it, asking him, well, how do we do that? How can we possibly remedy segregation? I was one of those people that asked him that question. And, I was a community organizer and worked in housing policy, and Trump had just been elected. And when his book came out, so I understood that we had to do something, but it wasn't clear to me what we could do. It felt so entrenched, the segregation of our country, so entrenched, so overwhelming. How can we possibly make a difference? So he got that question enough times. He realized he had an obligation to answer it using the platform he had, and he got me to help him work on the second book, Just Action, to answer that question. And so really quickly, just to set a little more context, one of the main, there are obviously many government policies and practices that created segregation. One of the most powerful in the mid-20th century was when the country was suburbanized. So after World War II, we weren't a suburban economy. Most people lived in urban centers near where the jobs were. Those urban centers were fairly racially integrated because that's where everybody worked. After World War II, there was a housing shortage for returning war veterans. The federal government wanted to meet the demand for housing by helping to subsidize building new housing. And it did so by building new housing outside of urban areas to create suburbs where they didn't already exist and to move white families out of those urban areas into the suburbs. So are you all familiar with this, how this happened? Yeah, so Levittown is one of the most famous examples where the federal government through the FHA provided federally backed loan guarantees to help build 11,000 homes. And as a requirement for getting those loan guarantees, builders like William Levitt had to put racially restrictive covenants on the deeds of those homes, saying that the home could only ever be owned or occupied by whites. Now, this wasn't just in Levittown or in the South. This happened here in Milpitas. That was an example written about in The Color of Law when the auto factories moved from Richmond to Milpitas, and they built homes for the workers. It explicitly prohibited African-American auto workers or anyone from living in those homes. They had to commute from Richmond or lose their jobs, which many did. San Lorenzo is another example. It was a community built within San Leandro that was restricted to whites only. So this happened all over, subsidized, required by the federal government, written in the FHA manual that those federally backed loans would only go to subdivisions and suburbs that had these racially restricted covenants. So we might think that that was a long time ago, that isn't relevant anymore to today's housing landscape or our racial disparities in this country. I'm sure you all know that that's not true. Not speaking to the choir, but so the example of Levittown and homes in Milpitas and San Lorenzo, when those homes were first built and sold on a restricted basis, they were affordable to working families of any race. They cost about $100,000 today. So if you can imagine buying a home in a nice suburban development for $100,000 today. It seems unbelievable and impossible, which it is. Because those homes are now worth, here, $1 million or more. In Levittown, the median home price is over $600,000. So those white families who got into home ownership with the help of the federal government, not only through subsidizing the developer, but through subsidizing their mortgages through the FHA and the VA, those white families, they accumulated wealth. Now, they didn't buy homes with that plan. That wasn't how home ownership worked, or that wasn't people's expectation back in the 40s and 50s, but that's what happened. They built up wealth. They could use that wealth to send their kids to college, to weather health emergencies or enjoy their own retirements. Most importantly, they can use that wealth to hand it down to their kids and grandkids to help them put down payments on their own homes. So this is why we have the wealth gap we have in this country, that, we have an income gap between Blacks and whites. That is an issue that should be addressed by a different book and a different set of policies. But the average African-American household income is about 60% of average white household income. You would think the wealth gap, all else being equal, should be about the same. All else is not equal. So the wealth gap, it ranges, depends on how you calculate wealth. 5 to 15% of white household wealth is what average African-American household wealth is. And that huge disparity is due almost, primarily to these policies that helped whites accumulate wealth through home ownership and explicitly prohibited African Americans from doing the same. So that, the wealth gap is one of the ongoing consequences, impacts of segregation, that even though the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, that said anyone can buy homes in these communities now. Those restrictive covenants, they've been, irrelevant for a while, even before 1968, but it's sort of an empty promise when white families have the wealth they need to be able to afford to buy those homes and have a down payment to pay for those homes. African-American families are far less likely to have that kind of wealth to be able to afford homes. Aside from the wealth gap, our segregated neighborhoods underlie our most serious racial disparities in this country, our most serious social problems. Because of the segregation of our neighborhoods, we have disparities in income outcomes, educational outcomes, health outcomes between children who grow up in segregated African-American communities compared to children who grow up in segregated white communities. I could go into a lot more detail on that, but just one example, segregated African-American communities, because of zoning, are more likely to be closer to highways, to industry that pollute the air, older buildings with lead paint in them, or playgrounds that are built on old industrial sites. Those children absorb all of those toxins. They're more likely to have asthma and have, as they grow up, have higher rates of cardiovascular disease, higher rates of cancer, and shorter life expectancies than similar white children who grow up in segregated white communities. So we have an obligation, a constitutional obligation, to address segregation because of the unconstitutional manner in which it was created. And we have a responsibility as citizens, residents of this country, to address these disparities, because it really has so much to do with the quality of our lives, the length of our lives, the health of our communities. So how do we do that? Well, what we argue in Just Action is that in order to remedy and challenge segregation, we need a newly activated civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement took on many aspects of segregation, segregated lunch counters, schools, transportation, but it left residential segregation virtually untouched. With all of those wins of the civil rights movement, we still have segregated neighborhoods. We haven't solved that issue. And so what we argue is that we need to reinvigorate the civil rights movement to take on this issue. And to do that, we need to start locally. As we all know, there's a lot of noise on the federal level about a lot of things. None of it is, setting the stage for big wins in terms of civil rights or advances in racial equity or housing justice. But we can do a lot on the local level. So even though the federal government played a large role in creating segregation, once it's created, to a large extent, it's local policies and practices that maintain and sustain that segregation. So we can build up the support on the local level for these kinds of policy changes, and we can get them passed, and they can effectively challenge segregation going forward and remedy the harms that exist because of the past government policies that created it. So how do we do that? Well, what we argue is that to start this newly activated civil rights movement with groups on the local level taking on local issues, first we have to understand what those issues are. So that's why we wrote this book, to help show that, it's not rocket science. There's very little in the book that is our original thought. We just sort of gathered a lot of information from different sources to put it all in one place and show that, look, there's so much that we can do. There's so many levers and issues that can affect segregation from the past, the harms from the past and affect it going forward, that the local sort of government, local policies and practices have a lot of control over. So to do that, we argue that we need to build some committees in our own communities, groups, coalitions, ready to take on this issue locally. These groups should be biracial, multi-ethnic, shared leadership between different races and ethnicities. And to do that, we need to start building relationships across races. Many people live in segregated communities, so they don't have natural social contact with people of other races. It's kind of logical. You live in a community where everybody looks like you. You go to the grocery store, drop your kids off at school, you meet people who look like you. And so it takes some intentional effort to build these cross-race relationships, build up some social capital that we can then use to work together to advocate for change. We give some examples in the book of communities or groups that have done this, just to show that it's not impossible to take these extra steps. One from California that isn't in the book, but I wrote about in our Substack column, is a group in San Diego County called the Sister Cities Project. They decided to use that model of, when a city has a sister city in another country, to give mutual support and learn about each other. They did that within their own county. So sister sort of cities in San Diego County, an affluent area and an under-resourced area, and they build relationships. They have community sort of educational campaigns and events, and they're focused on entrepreneurial support and growing entrepreneurs in the under-resourced areas. So they are building social connections and networks for people to be able to do that. So again, not impossible, but does take some intentional effort to break down the divides that we all live with. So then these groups are formed. Maybe they start to learn about the history of their own community, how it came to be segregated, so they can start to see how intentional it was and start to understand that equally intentional efforts can challenge and undo some of that segregation. So then once they're formed, there's so many policies and practices on the local level that they can take on. And we describe dozens of them in Just Action and give examples of communities that have successfully implemented those strategies. And what they do is collectively, they have to look to the future. We have to ensure that we're not continuing to create segregation as we're building more housing and building out our communities. And we need to look to the past. We need to remedy those disparities that exist today. We have to do what the Fair Housing Act didn't do, which is look to the past and remedy those racial disparities so that we can remedy the harms of those policies that created segregation. So then we group the strategies and policies into a few main categories. The first are place-based initiatives or strategies. So these are strategies concerned with increasing investments in lower income segregated African-American neighborhoods, where the concentration of poverty is a direct result of the same policies that created and sustained its segregation. Because as we all know, those policies that created segregation didn't create equal communities, right? They segregated people, and then they also segregated resources. So white communities have access to more resources, access to more opportunity for those residents. Segregated African-American communities have less access to that resources and investments. So to remedy the impacts of those government policies and that outcome of segregation, we want to increase investments in resources in those lower income communities. And breathe. Trying to fit a lot in. So we also understand when you increase resources and investments in lower income communities, oftentimes what happens is that people with higher incomes suddenly become interested in living in those often urban areas. And they are willing to pay more to live there. So they raise the housing prices in those communities. We call this gentrification. The longtime residents of those areas are then priced out of their communities just when they're starting to see an increase of investment and resources. So these place-based strategies should be coupled with anti-displacement strategies. What we argue is you can't completely, the only way to completely prevent displacement from increased investment is to not increase the investment. So what we have to do is balance that increased investment with preventing as much displacement as we can. There will always be people who want to sell their homes to the highest bidder and make the wealth that they were denied for generations in that community. So that, we don't want to disallow that, but we want to prevent some of the displacement of people who don't want to be displaced. So we can do that with renter protections. And these are all locally passed initiatives or ordinances. So protecting renters from rapidly increasing rents, protecting renters from unjust evictions through just cause eviction ordinances. Also protecting renters who are facing evictions by providing them a free right to an attorney, right to counsel programs that are often funded by local government to provide a free access to an attorney for low income tenants who are facing evictions. These tenants often have no recourse when they're called to court for an eviction proceeding. They often don't even go because they don't know what they can do. Their landlords often do have lawyers. Those evictions are often rubber stamped and just pass through the courts. When those tenants have representation, they're far more likely to be able to stay in their units or at least keep an eviction from being on their permanent record, which is hugely impactful. Other of these policies include inclusionary zoning, which again, a locally passed policy that requires that when new housing is constructed, new market rate housing, a certain percentage has to be affordable to lower and moderate income families. And we go a step further and say that when that happens in the gentrifying community, those newly created affordable units should have some kind of preferences put on them to ensure that the people at risk of being displaced from that community have access to those units. We can also use the Community Reinvestment Act to ensure that banks are equitably investing in the lower income neighborhoods in their service areas. So the Community Reinvestment Act is a federal policy that often falls to local community activists and advocates to enforce its requirements that banks don't only provide bank branches and loans to higher income neighborhoods within their service areas. So that's the place-based strategies. We also talk about mobility strategies. And these are strategies for ensuring that segregated, whiter, usually suburban, expensive communities are more accessible to more diverse residents. So desegregating the suburbs is equally as important as increasing investments in lower income segregated communities. There's several ways to do that. Zoning reform, which I'll get into a little more in a bit, but we hear a lot about that right now. This is kind of it overlaps with how desegregation efforts can overlap with addressing the current affordable housing crisis we're in by reforming zoning to allow more housing diversity in communities that are currently expensive and inaccessible to most people. Providing subsidies, rental, homeownership subsidies to African Americans to move into communities that they've historically been excluded from. Making the housing choice voucher program a better tool for lower income tenants to be able to move to higher opportunity communities. And as I'm sure many of you are familiar with the program, there's a lot of locally controlled pieces of that program that help Section 8 tenants be able to use those vouchers to move out of high poverty areas. And then the other category of strategies we talk about have to do with home ownership, increasing home ownership opportunities for African Americans in any type of neighborhood, not specific to what kind of area they want to live in, but increasing their opportunity to access home ownership anywhere. And then addressing ways that the home ownership experience is a less effective tool for building wealth for African Americans than it is for whites. And that is, we have a chapter in the book about homeownership strategies. And we start that by saying that increasing homeownership for African Americans is important for redressing segregation, but alone it's not enough because their wealth building potential once in homeownership is limited because of policies that still have racially discriminatory impact. Those include policies and practices. So appraisal, bias in the appraisal process where homes in African American communities are appraised lower than they should be because of bias on the part of appraisers themselves or the system of how appraisals work. There's also disparities in the property tax assessment system. So this is true all across the country where homes in lower cost, more likely communities of color are assessed at higher than their true market values when calculating their property tax bills than homes in white communities. So as a result, lower income or African American Hispanic homeowners are overpaying in property tax bills to whites in the same, in the same county. When you're paying too much for property taxes, it's harder to build as much wealth in your homeownership experience because you have more output in the money you're bringing in. So that's, again, a locally controlled issue that is hugely important and one I didn't know about before researching this book, but we can get into more of that later. But I want to get into some more specifics about these policies. So we argue throughout the book that the strategies that we advocate should be race specific in how they're designed and implemented. And we understand that that's a touchy subject right now, especially with the Supreme Court's decision around affirmative action. A lot of folks are hesitant or just not interested in talking about being race specific in our solutions. Now, we argue that, I understand that hesitancy, but we can't solve racial disparities that were created on a race specific basis with race neutral remedies. They just won't solve and remedy those harms. So for example, a down payment assistance program that's targeted at first-time homebuyers will reach more African Americans than one targeted at the general population. But it will still benefit more whites than African Americans because there are more whites who are first-time homebuyers. So then some folks are trying to narrow that down and make down payment assistance programs eligibility by first-generation homebuyers to try to get closer to reaching more African Americans than without being race specific. And that's a better solution. You get, you narrow the pool more. There's proportionally more African Americans in that pool of first-generation homebuyers, but still more whites will benefit from that program than African Americans. The only way to truly remedy the policies that result in African American homebuyers not having down payment they need is to provide race-specific down payment assistance programs. We have a whole chapter in the book about the Supreme Court and its inconsistent interpretation of the Constitution when it comes to racial equity, racial justice issues. And that, what we argue is that there's no reason to sort of stop what we know is the correct remedy for these past harms because of the current makeup of the Supreme Court. That we have to have the courage to implement these solutions, even though we might be sued or it might result in litigation. But, in time that will build up some case law that can support our programs. And the more narrowly focused these programs are to remedy a narrowly focused harm, the more effective they can be and the more likely they are to survive legal scrutiny. So we profile in the book a couple of individuals that have started down payment assistance programs. One in Pasadena, she's a real estate professional, and she started learning about the history of Pasadena's segregation and decided to do something about it. And she started an organization called the Green Line Housing Foundation, and they collect donations and give grants to homebuyers who are African American or Hispanic to help them get into a home. It's not income restricted. Because the racial wealth disparity is not income restricted. And so how she describes her program is she's standing in for family wealth that these folks don't have because of past government policy. And she's been raising money from individuals, companies, including a law firm in Pasadena that was the primary author of the restrictive covenants in that city in the 40s and 50s. And that law firm is now touts itself as a progressive law firm in the city. And when, so they're reconciling with that past. And one way they're doing that is supporting Green Line Foundation. So again, another individual who lived in Pasadena, and his parents, he's white, his parents benefited from all these programs we're talking about. When his parents passed away and he sold their house, he gave 10% of the proceeds of that sale to the Green Line Foundation. So these are ways that people are creating race-specific solutions and reconciling, the past policies and practices to create solutions and remedies that are specific for addressing those past practices. So if we don't want to, understand that asking folks to potentially defy what they think the Supreme Court will say is a tall order for some. And so there are also ways we can do this that fall under current federal law. One way is the special purpose credit program. You all heard it, anybody heard of this? So this is authorized through the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. It's been on the books since like 1976, I believe. It allows financial institutions and anyone who gives loans, mortgages, to create a racially specific financial benefit if it can do a study to show that that race has been discriminated against or disadvantaged by the financial industry in the past. So that's not hard to do, that study. So it means that banks can create race-specific down payment assistance programs under the Special Purpose Credit Program Authority. Some have started to do that in the last few years. Again, this has been around my whole life since the 70s, and they're only just starting to do it. And I say pretty tentatively, banks are starting to adopt these. So this is something we can do in our own communities, is advocate that our local banks adopt special purpose credit programs that actually are targeted at the race of the individual, not the racial makeup. So that's how private institutions can have these race-specific remedies. Public institutions can also adopt special purpose credit programs, and Washington State is the first public institution to do this. So through its Housing Finance Commission, last year the legislature in Washington passed the Washington Covenant Homeownership Act. This is an act that, based on research done throughout the state at the University of Washington to identify the racially restrictive covenants around the state, they found over 50,000, they inventoried them. And this led legislators to think, oh, wow, this was really pervasive here in Washington. People in the West, we like to think that we escaped the racial discrimination of the past. So they, see it in black and white on the deeds of these homes, and they saw, that it actually did happen in Washington. And so they started to think about what they could do about it. And they passed a law that allowed the Housing Finance Commission to create a special purpose credit program to provide down payment assistance that is race specific, targeted at those races that were excluded from homeownership by these racially restrictive covenants and other state-sponsored policies or state-sponsored programs. So people who lived in the state and were of races that were discriminated against, or who are descended from those people and currently live in Washington, can have access to this down payment assistance program. So this is it just passed last year. They did their study. I believe now they're designing their program. It's something to watch and something that I think other states should be replicating. So again, it's not impossible to be race specific in our solutions. There's ways to do it under the authority of current federal law. And to get into one more big issue, why not? And this has to do with zoning, which I mentioned before. Now, there's a lot of attention on zoning around the country as a way, which I think is important and necessary as a way to address our affordable housing crisis. We haven't built enough housing in this country to meet the demand, and so housing prices are too high for most people to be able to afford. One of the reasons we haven't built enough housing is because most residentially zoned land in the country is zoned only for single family homes. The single family only zoning, what most people don't know is it was born out of racialized zoning. So it used to be that cities zoned their residential neighborhoods by race. This neighborhood in their zoning maps said this neighborhood is a white zoned neighborhood. This is a black zone neighborhood. And that's how they created or sustained segregation. At some point, the Supreme Court said that that wasn't constitutional. And so what took the place of racialized zoning is single family only zoning. By zoning those white areas to only allow one home per lot, it ensured that the homes in those areas in those neighborhoods remained expensive because they couldn't build more homes or smaller homes to meet demand. So as demand rose, the prices of those homes just rose. That now has happened, compounded all over the country, and we're in this housing crisis that we're in. So rezoning areas that are zoned only for single family homes is an essential piece both to address desegregation and to get us out of this housing crisis. So by opening up communities, specifically suburban single family only communities, to more diverse housing types, so allowing accessory dwelling units, allowing more dense developments near transit, for example, allowing duplexes or triplexes to be built on a lot instead of only one home. These are all ways to allow a broader range of housing types in these communities that would then we think would provide a broader range of affordability. This is naturally occurring affordable housing. If the homes are smaller, logically, you would assume those homes are slightly less expensive than the larger single family homes. Now, this is an important way to begin to address the needs for housing, the missing middle. So we have a misunderstanding in this country that if we want to address the housing needs of African Americans, we need to be looking at low income housing. Now, most African Americans are not low income, so they wouldn't qualify for low income housing. Most African Americans are middle income. Many of us in the middle income that can't afford market rate housing because it's too expensive and make too much to qualify for low income housing. And there's not a lot of subsidies out there to build middle income housing. So we advocate, but they are expanding. There's a lot more than since we wrote Just Action in the last couple of years. A lot of states have adopted more middle income housing programs. But by rezoning and allowing, more housing variety in suburban communities, it's one way of addressing the middle income housing need by creating smaller homes that are more naturally affordable. So now we know that, it's hard in and of itself to change zoning. And then when more dense housing is proposed in like a suburban community, it's hard to get those proposals adopted or passed because there's always opposition. We heard the opposers to more dense housing, call them NIMBYs, not in my backyard. I'm familiar with them here in California and around the progressive blue states where people say that they support housing, affordable housing in general until it's proposed in their own neighborhood. And then they're very against it. And they come out and they oppose these developments at city council meetings, at planning commission meetings, and oftentimes get them killed or prolong the process so long that it's no longer feasible for developers to build them. Now, we understand that this is a big obstacle towards densifying suburban communities, but that it's not one that we can't overcome. So my understanding of NIMBYs is they understand or they think that they are going to be personally negatively impacted by these new housing developments, by lower income housing or more dense housing being brought into their community. They've been told that it will lower their property values. This isn't true. Studies have disproven that idea, but it doesn't mean that they don't still believe it. Because they feel personally negatively impacted, they're very motivated to show up at these meetings and say something and oppose it. Now, we believe that there's just as many people in the community who support these kinds of initiatives. We support more dense housing, more affordable housing. They don't feel as personally impacted, so they're less motivated to show up at these meetings. And oftentimes, even the elected officials want to be able to support these initiatives and developments, but they need residents coming out to tell them that they want this kind of development in their communities as well. So what we need to do is find those supporters, organize them, turn them out to meetings ourselves, in our own communities, talking to our neighbors about proposed housing or rezoning efforts in our communities to build up the support that it needs to be able to pass. We wrote about, in the Substack column, about Menlo Park and their efforts to challenge NIMBYism. As we all know, Menlo Park is a very expensive community. And they, after the color of law came out, some people in Menlo Park started an organization called Menlo Together, where they developed educational training about the segregation of Menlo Park and their region and identified all of the government policies that created that segregation. And they they took it around the community and signed people up for their organization who wanted to have a more accessible, inclusive, diverse community than is currently possible with the housing prices in Menlo Park. And while this was all happening, the school district there, which was losing a third of its teachers every year because they couldn't find any housing near their schools that they could afford, they had a vacant piece of land in Menlo Park and proposed to build teacher housing, 90 units of teacher housing. Some of the neighbors around that site didn't like it, and they opposed this proposal, and they put a measure on the ballot called Measure V that would have made this development impossible and would have made any future rezoning in Menlo Park have to go before the voters. So it would have basically killed any future more affordable housing projects in that community. And so this group, Menlo Together, they had been learning about all these issues, the history, and they saw, oh, this is another piece, that's just another step in the history that has created and maintained segregation here. And so, now we can do something about it. So they started a campaign and they went door to door on the weekends to talk to voters. And I talked to some of the people who did that, and they told me about how, they had their voter sheets and they went up to these houses and they would look at the house and think, okay, these people are not going to be on our side, but I have to do it anyway. And they knocked and they would talk to the people who lived there, and the people who, many of their neighbors understood. And they said, yeah, the housing here is too expensive. My kids can't afford to move back. The people who work at my favorite cafe, everybody told me about their favorite cafe that was reducing its hours because it couldn't get employees because nobody could afford to live anywhere nearby on cafe salary. And so people started to understand how these policies that maintain the exclusivity of this community was harming everybody. They were shooting themselves in their feet. And they understood that teachers needed to be able to community. So they built up enough support. They defeated Measure the housing proposal that's going to go forward, and future affordable housing is still possible in that area. So it's a great example of how, we wouldn't think that Menlo Park necessarily would be a poster child for defeating NIMBYism, but it was because they had an understanding of the history and they were organized and worked together to defeat this initiative. So, let's see. I'll just say one more thing about zoning and then go to questions. And that is, there's a lot of movement on rezoning efforts around the country. A lot of cities, states, California has done this, sort of led the field in rezoning, single family only zoning. And we wrote about, in Just Action, we wrote about Minneapolis, because at the time when we wrote the book, a couple of years ago, it was the only and the first big city to adopt a rezoning plan that rezoned single family only zoning citywide. And it was unclear at the time what the effects of that rezoning would be on the city's segregation. It's a very segregated city, like every major metropolitan area in the country. To the extent that both sides in the debate and sort of supporters and opponents of this measure that would rezone the whole city, both said that they were supporting more affordable housing and less segregation in their city. So it's sort of unclear. We all can think that rezoning, either does the thing we want or doesn't do the thing we want. What Minneapolis did is it not only rezoned every single family lot to allow duplexes, but it didn't do that very well because the duplexes had to sit in the same building envelope as a single family only home. So it hasn't actually produced that many duplexes. So it's a lesson in being careful in how we design these rezoning efforts. But another big piece of their rezoning plan was to allow or to establish a minimum height requirement for housing built near transit, to reduce parking requirements, to allow accessory dwelling units. And all of those changes have led to an increase in housing production in Minneapolis. So because it was the first city to do this, we now have some data from the Pew Charitable Trust research folks have looked at what happened in Minneapolis since passing this rezoning effort. And what they found was Minneapolis, compared to the other 10 largest cities in the country, is the only one in the last several years to increase its housing supply. The only one of those 10 large cities to maintain rents at a steady level. Rents in Minneapolis have not shot up. And the only one to not lose African-American population. So it's a good indication that changing zoning and just allowing more housing to be built keeps housing prices down and allows for less displacement of people in those cities. Now, we don't yet have the data or know on what it has done to the sort of neighborhood level segregation in Minneapolis. And I imagine it hasn't changed that much because, again, without having being intentional about these things, they don't just sort of happen on their own. So more housing is always good, but without intentional efforts on top of that rezoning to ensure that the more housing that's built in the wider communities, are accessible to African-American families, it likely won't happen. But we're going to look out for that data and see. But it's a good indication for the rest of us around the country to understand how rezoning can actually help with a lot of these issues. So I think I'll stop and let's get into questions. But there's, I always end these wanting to talk about 5 more things. So I hope that it comes across that we're not sort of lacking in options or ideas in ways that we can start to address and redress segregation on the local level. We just need to get started. It kind of doesn't matter how we start, just that we do something. And I'll say that when I say that, that we do something, I mean us taking on these issues, not just at our desks or in our professions, especially as housing professionals, but also as members of our own communities, as residents of our neighborhoods, how we interact with our neighbors, how we talk about these issues locally, and what we're involved in really matters. That's how we're going to build this movement and try to correct some of those smarts. So thank you so much.
All right, we're going to do a quick scene change and set up. You've been standing for a while, so feel free to come sit down here. If you wrote questions on your index cards, please pass them over to this side, and I'm just going to come around and collect them, reminding our audience online that you can submit your questions through the chat and we'll make sure they're read. And then you can also raise your hand and ask a question if you'd like. So let's collect these. Thank you so much for such a comprehensive overview of such an incredible book. And, you really ran through a lot of the main topics, and I really appreciate everything that you've offered us today. So we're going to get right to it. You were sort of just talking about zoning reform as well as local support for affordable housing. Do you think that there is a more productive avenue that we should put our efforts towards, in terms of whether it's persuading residents to accept affordable housing in their neighborhoods or to try to bypass them in a way and focus on zoning reform?
I think both are essential. We need zoning reform to be able to allow those housing developments to even be imagined or proposed. And just because the zoning is changed, doesn't mean people won't still oppose them, those developments and those proposals. So we also need to do the community engagement work to build up support so that they're not, the development approval process isn't extended so long that it's infeasible, or so they're not like killed at the proposal phase. So both are essential.
Yeah, they kind of go hand in.
They go hand in hand. And I think it's also, I think some housing advocates do try to do this, but when like affordable or lower income housing development is proposed in an area that doesn't have a lot of affordable housing, the supporters who come out to support it at those city approval meetings are often the developers or, service agencies. And I think we need to do better at finding the potential residents or people who could access that housing, who don't yet live in that community, but could if it was proposed, to get them out to those meetings to show who actually could benefit and support it. So there's a lot that we can do to build up the narrative of who benefits and that we all benefit, from having a more diverse, inclusive neighborhood, and so bring those voices out too.
So relatedly, we had another question about that, like how you respond to people that argue property values going down, despite there being reports and studies, plenty of studies that disprove that, but even other things that we see a lot now, like parking and overcrowding, and I guess it's a tough question, but how do you confront those arguments effectively?
Yeah, how do you persuade people that they don't want to agree? I mean, some people are persuaded by facts, so you can show them the data that property values don't go down. And, in some of the most publicized, instances of this, like the Mount Laurel project in New Jersey had, huge community opposition. Once it was built, neighbors didn't even know that building down the street was an affordable housing development. So, you could probably find examples like that in our own communities where people don't even know that's, they have these ideas of what affordable housing looks like and who lives there and how it'll change their neighborhood. So we can prove to them with facts that that's not what happens. Property values don't decline. Oftentimes they go up because there's a new, nice looking building in the neighborhood on what might have been an underused lot. Another, what can be persuasive is this sort of understanding of the history. So people often argue against affordable housing or more dense housing because they want to preserve the character of their community. They want the small town feel, or they want whatever they think the character of the community means. Now, if we can understand the history of how zoning has been used to maintain that character, which is usually as all white or higher income people, then that can start to break down what people understand of their community, that it wasn't an accident. A lot of people, so many people have come up to me who've read The Color of Law and said, I had no idea that my neighborhood looks the way it does because of these policies. I thought it was just because we all worked hard to be able to afford to live here or whatever reason, or, they like that community character. But once they understand how it came to be, some people are more likely to then support, once they understand what is this character that we're trying to defend, it's this exclusionary history, and is that really what we want?
Okay, from the audience, is the down payment assistant based on market rate of a property or property value, i.e. county tax collector? The difference could be significant. Is there a limit to the assistance amount?
It depends on the program. So for the Washington program that I talked about, there is a maximum amount. I think it's up to 25,000. The Green Line program I talked about, I think they offer up to 10% of the price of the home. And their only requirement is that the buyers put in some of their own money into that down payment. I don't know exactly how much it has to be, but just that they have saved something. The Washington program is income restricted. So, all of these programs, they do have some problems with when housing is so expensive. So 25,000 won't get you that far in, a lot of communities here. So it's a start and it is a good sort of step forward, but it doesn't solve it completely. And there was another question sort of embedded in that question around the property tax assessment. And I briefly mentioned that, but that is, I think, should I get into that?
Yeah, there was another question
Okay.
on property taxes, so we're covering a few.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So how the property tax system works is, the county needs to collect a certain amount of money to cover all of the county services. And it does that by figuring out what the county tax assessor thinks all of the homes in the county are worth. And then what percentage of that worth would cover the county's expenses. And then everybody is assessed that percentage on the assessed value of their home. So 1%, 2%, whatever the percentage is. And the issue is how those home values are determined, because the only way to really know how much a home is worth is when it's sold. Most homes aren't sold every year, but you still have to pay your taxes on some assessed value. So what happens is usually the county tax assessor will create an assessed value countywide of all of the homes based on size, number of bathrooms, based on some like algorithm that they use. One issue is that first assessment usually isn't correct. They don't look at how the quality of the house, the condition it's in. So often homes and they don't sort of determine how much homes are selling for. They're just kind of looking at the structural issues of the homes or the neighborhoods that they're in. And then most county assessors don't do reassessments very often. Homes change values around here very quickly. Now this isn't the same issue in California because we have Prop 13, but in the rest of the country, this is how it works. So in the times that they don't do an accurate reassessment, they're just adjusting everybody's assessed value by the same percentage based on if they think the market's going up or down. So all assessed values go up and down at the same rate. But what really happens in real life is the actual values of homes in whiter communities are rising faster than that rate that every house is being adjusted at. And homes in segregated communities of color are not rising that fast. Those values are not rising that fast, and sometimes they're declining. So as a result, people in those segregated lower income areas are paying property taxes on an assessed value that's higher than the actual value of their home. So they're paying a higher tax bill. And homes in white areas are paying property taxes on an assessed value of their home that's lower than their actual home value. So you can take homes that are actually sold for the same price in 1 year, and one, more likely a lower income homeowner of color is paying a lot higher property tax than the white homeowner. So there's a researcher at the University of Chicago. He has it's called the Property Tax Project. And you can go in there and put any county in the search bar, and it gives you a full report of the disparities in the effective tax rates in that county. And it is happening all over the country. We wrote about this and looked into some counties that hadn't done reassessments in 40 or 50 years. So, it just compounds the longer that the tax assessor isn't looking at this issue. And so now some places are starting to look at it and try to figure out how to fix the system, but it takes, again, local effort because those are locally elected or appointed positions, the tax collectors, so they're tax assessors. So it's up to us to kind of make sure that that's happening.
That's very fascinating. I didn't know that. I don't know if anyone here, that's new to me. Yeah, I feel like that's a really difficult thing for voters and people showing up at these meetings or city council meetings to know. It's obviously very complicated. You had your hand up.
Some counties in some states, some assessors, city services, and calculate assessment rates. And so, they look at data, these services, ambulance services to certain this as well, which policemen, some of the sort of health disparities that contain those those areas of there's huge racial disparities. So the costs associated with those and charge them back to reflected in.
So charge the people who need more services more.
Yes, so sometimes in some assessment, algorithms. They try to, they'll take the city services.
Yeah, there's a lot to fix in that system.
Yeah, okay, I want to make sure I get all the people who submitted questions. Do we have anything online yet? No, and I don't just, how are we on time? What?
It's 2:01.
Oh, okay, this is the last one from an audience member. Okay, so Equal Opportunity investigates cases of housing discrimination and works with nonprofit grantees to uphold the Fair Housing Act. What additional work would you like to see or think that HUD should be doing to help create fair housing for all? So you touched a little bit on enforcement in your book and in this talk. So yeah, what kind of effective and vigorous enforcement do you visualize?
Yeah, we write a lot about Section 8, housing choice voucher, and enforcing source of income discrimination ordinances, enforcing where there isn't a source of income ordinance that outlaws discrimination against Section 8 tenants, where Section 8 discrimination is used as a cover for racial discrimination. So investigating where that's occurring, stopping that more. And this, as you all probably know, fair house or paired testing programs is what can find where discrimination is occurring by sending testers to pose as renters or home buyers and see how they're treated, people of different races or people use Section 8 and don't. And that's how we find where discrimination is occurring. We need more of that, those kinds of programs. And also to be investigating realtors as well. And we write about this as well, of ensuring that, not only, I know HUD does realtor testing, I believe, and real estate associations often do their own testing, but there isn't a lot of follow-up, as I understand, to the results of those tests. So when a realtor is found to have discriminated in a paired testing program, there should be repercussions. They shouldn't be able to renew their license, for example. We should be checking on the fair housing training that realtors are getting. Are you all familiar with the Long Island Newsday expose? So that was done in 2019 in Long Island. It did a paired testing program with realtors and found, discrimination was rampant. Basically, they had pinhole cameras on their testers. They used actors from New York City. And they were, I think it was African Americans were treated differently than white home seekers over 50% of the time. And they also sat in on the fair housing training that realtors were receiving, and it was done by the former president of the state realtor board in New York, or maybe it was a regional one. And he said that fair housing rules are kind of like the speed limit. Like you obey them when you want to, and just hope you don't get caught. And this was in the training. So we need more monitoring of those kinds of trainings and we shouldn't be afraid. The state licensing boards should be pulling licenses of realtors that aren't complying with fair housing requirements. And so I think HUD can participate in that sort of testing and enforcement and those issues as well. And then the larger issues, which I know you all work on, we wrote about crime-free housing initiatives and so fighting those on the fair housing violations that they are. And, this issue that we've been talking a lot about opposition to affordable housing. I know HUD has done a lot of litigation around this community character kind of idea and how the racial undertones of that and prosecuting when that is proven to be a fair housing violation, which it often is. And so I think more of all of that.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we could chat forever, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you all for attending. Thank you all for attending online. And your book's available. And if you want to learn some of these concepts, dive into them, you can get the book and Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you all so much.
You made it. So much talking.
Yeah, that is.
Assessment. Blows my
Yeah.
mind. Is that